A victim, and then we got rescuers. Okay. Now, what do rescuers say or do that makes them stand out very similar to the victims?
Well, they reinforce some of those victimizing thought processes.
Okay.
Like, it's not your fault.
Right. Okay. So there's two things that really I agree with what you're saying, but I'm going to kind of emphasize it in kind of the vocabulary around this.
Sure.
The victims need somebody that's going to reinforce this idea that they're hopeless, helpless, and blameless, that it's unfair, and the rescuers are basically the enablers. They're going to they're going to keep caretaking the victim in their victimhood, allowing the victim to just sit in that state. Okay. What's interesting about this is the rescuers, they feel good for helping, and they'll say, well, I'm being helpful to these people. Okay. So they'll say, I'm good for helping. But the liability in the rescuers is they do one thing that is really detrimental to a victim, and they never say no. Okay? So
no boundaries.
Right. So when they never say no, this is the person that they'll always go to that's always, oh, you're okay, you're fine. Those are the people that in my alcoholism I'd come to and say, hey, can I have $100? Paid all my bills. You know, I just am a little short for my, electric bill this month. And you keep using them and using them and using them. And these people, because of this, they'll always align with this statement of, I'm here for you, I'll always be there for you, but they build up huge amounts of resentment. Okay? So the third role, okay, like really finishes off this process, because these roles are dynamic enough to where what happens is we're jumping between them all the time in a codependent relationship. And this is the judge and the critic. Now, what are the judge and critic? What are the words or vocabulary that they use that kind of signify or really label this in creating kind of the drama between these roles? Any ideas?
I would guess that they use a lot of like shame-based verbiage to the victim character.
And all of that shame-based vocabulary is always based on one concept: that this person is right, this person is wrong, and this person is wrong. Okay, so the biggest problem here is this is coming out of the I'm right process. Because they'll even say things like, if they just do what I told them to do, there wouldn't be any problem. Here's the struggle with that, though. Okay, now somebody that's really steeped in this in the culture of shame, they'll do this to themselves without a third party or a second or third party involved. They'll go into a hopeless, helpless, blameless state. The way that they feel good for helping, or that they'll never say no to themselves, is that they typically use behaviors like drinking or drugging, okay, to remove themselves from their victimhood temporarily, and then when they sober up, they go into that judge and critic role where they're like, go to hell, and you're a victim, and they're like, yeah, you're right, I'm going to do this. So I don't need a secondary party to do this, but when I'm involved in a relationship with somebody else, this is where it doubles down and it gets very, very sick, and that's what literally creates the drama. But there's one other element that I haven't really talked about here that we have to also understand as well, that really signifies why it's so detrimental. Okay, so this is why it's called codependency. I'm dependent on these roles of validating or invalidating my emotional stability. And when I'm feeling shame, I'm either going to be looking for the rescuer, or I'm going to look within the judge or critic, and it's going to reinforce this, but it's always going to revert back to drama. Okay? The big issue is, like, why do we stay in that? Okay? Any ideas? Okay, so there's a foundation that's built here, okay, and this is the foundation. It's not only the emotion of fear, it's also the idea that false evidence appears real. In other words, you know, the victim believes that the circumstance and situation that they live in is just absolutely the only thing that they can understand and live in. The rescuers, okay, so the victims come out of this state called addiction, whatever addiction that is, okay, if you even want to call it shame, that's fine. The rescuers are the codependents, or enablers, and the judges and critics typically are the ACOAs. Okay, the adult children of alcoholics or addicts. Okay, so they have little flexibility around people that are involved in addiction, and they're very, very inflexible dealing with anything like these behaviors, their behaviors, and they're always taking the position of their right. But the thing that drives us, the thing that like keeps us in this drama cycle, because as the roles are playing out, you steep yourself in more drama. Okay. Because obviously it's a cycle, but the thing that keeps us stuck in it, okay, and keeps us revolving again and again and again is we start a fear-based belief system, and it just continues to cycle through a process of shame and guilt, and it doesn't stop. Okay, now, any questions? Does this make sense to everyone? Okay, so the roles are important to understand, but there's dynamics that keep us locked into this so that we never change. Now the dynamics are really important because there's 3 of them. Okay. So there's no personal responsibility. Okay, there's no accountability. And there's no boundaries. And that keeps a lot of our clients that are codependent locked into a style that the only thing that they really derive out of a relationship, more often than not, is a higher state of drama as things progress. They're living out these roles, but they can never separate themselves from the role. All of it's done through a fear-based belief system, and they can never unlock themselves from this process because they're not taking any personal responsibility of creating it. They're not having any accountability to help them see what they need to do to get out of it, and they're not establishing boundaries that would break the whole process. Is that pretty clear to everyone? Okay, so a really important question was, okay, for me, when I originally came across this, like, what then do we need to do for our clients to help them get out of it? Any idea?
Boundaries. Start setting boundaries.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the most important thing. I need boundaries in order to stop this insane way of living, but I can't do that until these first 2 show up, because I can't establish a boundary unless I'm personally responsible and I have accountability in my life. So the dynamics have to change. This is the first thing that's going to actually shift me out of the drama cycle and get me into a state of relationship that allows me to have peace and serenity without all that shame and guilt hanging over my head because of the fear that I live in. Okay? So, with that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to create a different dynamic. Okay? And that dynamic is now going to be, okay, I'm going to be personally responsible. I'm going to build accountability in my life. But these aspects, okay, as I'm building personal responsibility, accountability, and boundaries, these roles are going to shift. Remarkably so Okay, and the reason that I've erased that dependent line here is I've got to formulate a new way of living through boundaries, and boundaries are like what's changing, okay, the whole process. So that process is going to be how I relate to my environment and other people through a process of personal responsibility, accountability, and my boundaries. So here's you as an individual or the client, okay? This is others, okay? So the key here really is I've got to learn how to quit building dependency on other people to tell me or validate the state that I'm living in, and I've got to learn to truly love myself with no reservation. In other words, that love is an unconditional love, and it just continually has to be built. But that building of that has to be based on these principles, because if these principles aren't there, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between this paradigm and then the codependency. So in this one, this is an unconscious state. So to go to a conscious state, that's the personal responsibility that's going to start shifting all of this. Okay, so apologize, I don't have a bigger eraser, but this then becomes where I start developing a different type of relationship, a spiritual-based relationship with a higher power. We can call it God, okay, whatever really works for the client. But it's also an invitation where when I'm working with and relating to other people, I've also got to change this fear-based belief system into a different foundation of why do I do the things I'm doing, okay? And that really then comes out of nothing other than a pure, undiluted form of love. But it has to start with myself, extending it to a higher power, and then learning to extend that to other people so that I don't get stuck in this codependent, relationship that I've built in the past. Okay. So the real key here is in Alcoholics Anonymous, they refer to the new standard, or the new standard by which we live, okay, is love and tolerance. So when I put love here, it's also love and tolerance, because one of the things I have to tolerate is I have to learn to tolerate my past, to learn to then work with that, to love myself in a completely different way through personal responsibility, accountability, and the new boundaries that I live. So that what I'm doing is I'm undoing the roles that I've created, okay, that I've lived so long in, so that what I do is I create a higher standard, okay, of removing drama from my life. But this doesn't entirely remove me from it because of what I'm about to say, okay? So I'm working on creating an interdependent relationship. And that interdependent relationship is I have to, if I'm building personal responsibility, I have to look at what's my role in all the problems that are part of my life, and what do I need to do to resolve those, okay? And we have to look at ourselves as that critical core part of the problem, and then we also see, how do I become the solution to this problem? So from there, once I've been working on these ideals, the whole idea about my new roles is that I work on developing and turning everything over to a higher power. I work on truly loving myself, and then through the process of boundaries, because my goal, my values, and the things that I'm working to improve myself so I don't get stuck back into that fear-based belief system, is that I'm not going to be dependent on other people telling me who I am, or what I'm not. That's all an intrinsic process. Therefore, it's an interdependent relationship where I'm depending on starting to understand my intrinsic value, working on a spiritual-based concept through love and relationship, to then extending that to other people through a process of boundaries, so that I don't get caught up in doing the drama cycle anymore. but that I learn how to break free of that and live free. Okay, the real freedom here is freedom from shame and guilt. Okay, so, and then others. Real challenge is the drama cycle still over here. And what I mean by that is if I'm in a relationship and the other people around me aren't doing these same principles, aren't living their lives by the same principles, guess what I get wrapped back into? The drama cycle again. Because they're still doing the victim, the rescuer, the judge and critic, and I can't always stay in a conscious state because this is really a very, very energy consuming process. This is where I have to be really in the moment and living in the now to actually have this happen. And when people around me aren't doing that, I can very quickly get drawn back into the drama and I start falling back into the role. So the real key is like, I've got to be very aware of what roles I'm playing. When I was going through and I was talking about the position that the victim, rescuer, and judge and critic take, I have to be really, really on top of like, am I speaking from a position of like being hopeless, helpless, and blameless? That's the victim. Am I speaking from a position where I want to help, but that codependency in me is like coming out, and I never say no to people, which means that I don't ever develop boundaries with them? Or am I always taking the judge and critic role and creating kind of that standard where I'm shaming people into going into victim, okay? And as I go through that process, I learn very quickly how to get into and out of, the codependency that plays out, okay? Now, the one thing that was really interesting is that as I went through and I developed this years ago, I started really looking at how the 12-step based philosophy is really run and built, and it's uniquely built to help us do all of this naturally. It's got 12 steps that are specifically designed to get us out of the drama, to get us out of a fear-based belief system, and get us into loving ourselves again, okay, trusting God, and working with others through a process of personal responsibility, accountability, and boundaries. And those 12 steps are specifically designed to do everything that's written on this board, but it's a step-by-step process to help those people actually do it. Okay? Any questions so far?
Do you use this in cases of abuse as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because the very unique thing is I've found that as much as I derive this from working with addicts and alcoholics, it's universal because of how much codependency is really in our society. They've done some anecdotal studies where they've suggested that up to 90% of the population on some formal process is codependent in their interactions with other people. Okay, that's a lot of people. Okay, I'm not saying everybody's like really entrenched and really sick in it, but when I've invited people to just listen to how people talk, they all come back and they say, it's everywhere. And I'm like, yeah, it is. Okay. But it's that way because of the fact that we're always bouncing back and forth between the two. Sometimes we spend time here, sometimes we spend time here. It's like the real key is like how much time are we spending over there compared to over here. Okay. So when it comes to like really working with clients and helping them actually get out of the dynamics that keep them sick, the one thing that I have actually in another presentation is I talk about this idea of Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now. It's probably the best one I've ever read about it. It's like, what do we need to do to actually stay here and keep this like paramount in the world that we live in? And his idea in The Power of Now is like, we all need to learn presence. We need to live in the now, because that's where all of this exists. When we're not living here, what we're living in is we're living in the past, or we're living in the future, which is you know, this is all distraction. We've already been here. This hasn't even come to us yet, but this is either going to create a depression in our clients or anxiety. That becomes like a real big prominent issue, where if they learn how to live in the present moment, they learn these skills, and then they learn how to actually naturally do the things behaviorally that can assist them to get out of depressive states or anxiety states. But a lot of it is like behaviorally based. It's like, what aren't you doing? You know, it's like a big thing that I really focus on in my time working with clients is like really emphasizing the importance of like the physical state. Are they sleeping well? Are they exercising? Are they eating correctly? What are they eating? Have you tracked that? Does that impact their awareness of what's going on? And most of them will be very honest and say, yeah, I mean, I'm eating a lot of carbs, I'm eating a lot of junk food. And I'm like, how does that affect your overall health? Does that affect your concentration? Does that affect your sleep? And then from there, I really bring in the idea of like the mindful states, right? It's like my mind can be like really full of like all these distractions from my past or my future and my fears and my worries and my concerns, where I can live in the moment where I'm connected to everything that's going on, and I'm very aware of the present moment and what is going on and how to stay in that. The problem though is oftentimes a lot of the clients that I see, they've never been invited to meditate. They've never been invited to do, a lot of that mental process of like, where's a lot of your mental work going? Is it being consumed by these issues in your past, and you trying to figure out what needs to change and blaming others and still being a victim? Or are you really looking at it and being in the moment saying, that's my past, and these are the things that I'm doing to really learn to love myself and appreciate myself for who I am today, and not what I did or who I was in my life yesterday. And the big key there is to help them understand that what the real differences are, and helping them see that they can spend more time over here, but it's always going to be kind of a back and forth, just due to the fact that we live in a conscious state. We also live in very unconscious states, and the codependent nature of relationship is very unconscious. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to worry about it. I just kind of fall into the routine of just going through the motions and not really focusing on it. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's basically the drama cycle, and then the interdependent relationship, and what we need to do to really hone it down into a process that would be an invitation to assist people to get into more of those mindful states. Of living in the now. I explain to my clients that living in the now is the source of where you have all your peace, all your serenity, all the things that you're really looking for. But the problem is that due to the nature of drama and how it's worked out in our life, we don't trust that. But what we do trust is we trust bouncing back and forth from our past to our future, or past to our futures, but we don't spend enough time in the present moment. And that's where most of what we've got, specifically in the phone generation, we're so distracted by these things. Our clients are so distracted by these things. And it's almost as if they've been conditioned to live here and never live here. So that's, in a nutshell, the drama cycle. Any thoughts, questions?
You talked about 12-step. Just thinking about, okay, practical application. How are you applying this to clients here? I mean, are you bringing in 12-step things or?
Okay, so when I typically, I have this on a computer presentation, and basically I go through and I describe all of this before I even jump into the 12 steps. If I have somebody that's a real addict or alcoholic, I will literally break down every component, every step, to teach them how. It's designed to get all of this put together, okay? With clients that don't have an addictive problem, what I do is I just go through and I explain to them up to this point, the mindful state of like what that needs to look like, while just going over and saying the 12-step process is basically naturally included in like helping people do this. But I'm going to move on and I'm going to talk to you about living in the moment, okay? Most of what I typically have found is that most of them respond that they relate to the drama, they relate to living in the fear, they relate to bouncing around all of those roles of victim, rescuer, and judging critic with themselves and people in their lives, and that they really resonate with this idea of like, how do they love themselves? What do they need to do to actually make that happen? What are the boundaries that they need with other people, not to be codependent anymore, but interdependent? And what are the things that they need to do to really be connected with God? And the biggest thing for most of the clients I've had here that don't have substance abuse, what I've typically found is that there's so much in their head and they're dealing with like huge amounts of depression or anxiety or both, that what it basically comes down to is that there's so much fear of being something that they're not, because people have told them like, this is what you are, this is who you are, that they bought into that narrative, that the shame and guilt that they feel is like real, that they've never been given an invitation to say, is there a different way? Is there a different way of like perceiving this and perceiving yourself and like really learning to authentically love yourself for who you are and not what people have told you you are? And what I've found is most of what I have to focus on multiple times is like teaching them how to get in the now, utilizing and including mindful practices, meditation, exercise, grounding, being in the moment and taking everything in, and not like just being in their head, you know. So for me, it's been a really interesting exercise, not including the 12-step process, but like being able to talk to them outside of that and helping them understand that they've got this innately in them, but this is practice where they have to really think about it, but then they have to practice it in a process where they're applying it in the moment, and as they do, this stuff is naturally going to actually start occurring. And then what are the boundaries that they need to have with other people not to get drawn back into codependency? So great question, thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yeah. Tell me.
I just was thinking that in all roles, in all aspects, it seems like a lack of awareness
Yeah.
plays a huge part.
Yeah, I mean, being conscious, that is one of the hardest things to actually teach a client. Because what they've done more often than not, they've lived in that codependent state where they're unconscious of really what's going on. They just know there's a lot of drama in their relationship. And the idea is like, well, this relationship's not going anywhere. It's not providing me anything other than drama. Therefore, I need to go get a new one. And then when they actually get into another relationship, guess what happens? The same thing. So for me, when I describe it, it's like they laugh about it because they're like, that's just absurd. And I'm like, yeah, I get it, okay? Because you're not aware of what your part in this is and what the other party's part in this is and what you can actually do to change it all the time. And really what it comes down to is it just comes down to, you know, what are you personally responsible for, okay? What's the accountability? How do you develop that accountability where you're allowing yourself to like let your ego deflate and like tell people honestly what's going on and have them hold you accountable to actually staying here and actually creating the boundaries that you need to actually have a healthy relationship and not being dependent on other people for your self-esteem, okay, your self-concept, but you start developing that and building it yourself because you're living in the now, you're loving yourself, and you've got a relationship with a higher power that by its very nature is going to help you actually develop those boundaries that you need with other people not to be codependent anymore. Now that's a lot of work. It's really easy for me to say this. This isn't something that a client's going to naturally do in 2 sessions. This is an ongoing work where They have to learn the importance of like being willing to self-disclose. Have people in their lives that they trust enough that will give them the feedback to help them actually re-examine the boundaries, or what's worked today might not work tomorrow, but what does that look like? You know, and how do they like stay consistent with that enough to get the freedom from the shame and guilt that they've experienced in a relationship and within themselves in the past? Did that answer your question?
That was just an observation, thank
Okay.
you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks,
Okay,
Joe.
so
Thanks, Joe.
that in a nutshell is my presentation.